I crouched beside the body with my camera and tried to keep my hands steady. The man lay on his back in a patch of wet leaves a few feet off the trail, one arm bent under him, the other stretched toward a fallen log, as if he'd tried to drag himself forward. His name was Walter Keene, age 26, from Bowie. I knew that already from the county deputy standing behind me, but seeing his face made the name feel different than it had on paper. His mouth was open, there was mud on his teeth, and one of his boots was missing. I took the first photograph from above, then stepped to the side and took another at an angle to catch the marks on his coat. There were tears across the front, not cut cleanly, but pulled apart. His shirt beneath it showed 4 long rips running from the shoulder to the lower ribs. The skin there was opened in strips. I had seen knife work, and I had seen dog attacks. This matched neither. The spacing was too wide for a man's hand, and too even for an animal I could name with confidence. "Sheriff wants you to get the tracks before the light goes," Deputy Collins said. I heard him. Collins was young, broad through the shoulders, and trying to act used to death scenes. He had his hat off and kept rubbing the brim with his thumb. Every few seconds he looked back into the trees, not at any one place, but at the line where the woods deepened and the daylight stopped carrying. I set down my case, took out the scale marker, and placed it beside the torn cloth. Flies had already found the body, though the air was still cool enough to keep the smell from turning strong. October in Prince George's County had begun dry, but rain had come through 2 nights before, and the ground still held it under the top layer. Good for Prince, I thought. Bad for walking. Worse for anyone trying to run in the dark. I turned Walter's left wrist gently. There were bruises there, deep and dark, shaped almost like a grip, though the pressure points sat wrong. Too narrow at the center, too long at the edges. I photographed that too. "Where was the other hiker found?" I asked. "Not dead," Collins said. "Not yet, anyway. Ambulance took him in from the road by Governor Bridge. Shock. Cuts on his hands and face. He says they got split up." "Did he talk?" "Enough to keep crossing himself and asking where his friend was." Walter had a canvas pack a few yards away, split open across the bottom. I walked over and knelt again. Inside were 2 sandwich wrappers, a flashlight with dead batteries, a folded county trail map, and a cheap poncho. No liquor bottles. No hunting knife. No sign of a fight between friends that had gone bad. I photographed the pack, then the ground around it. That was where I saw the first track clearly. It had 2 long forward points pressed deep into the mud, split like a hoof, but stretched longer than any hoof should have been, with the back edge cutting sharply into the wet soil. It looked heavy. The stride to the next impression was longer than my own step. I counted 4 visible prints before they vanished into a bed of crushed ferns. Collins came closer when he saw me looking. "You see them too," he said quietly. "How many people have been through here since this morning?" "Just us, the sheriff, and 2 from the volunteer search party. We stayed off this side after we found him." I measured the track and recorded it, 5 3/4 inches at the widest point. Nearly 9 inches from the back edge to the tip, no sign of a heel. The depth suggested real weight. I took 3 photographs from different angles. "Could be a damaged hoof," Collins said, though he did not sound convinced. "On what?" I asked. "A horse walking upright." The breeze picked up and moved through the dry parts of the canopy. Somewhere farther in, something knocked once against wood. A single, hard strike. Collins turned fast enough to make the leather on his belt creak. "We should finish," he said. "We just started." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You didn't hear the call that came in. The boy on the road kept saying something followed them for an hour. Said every time they stopped hearing it, they got more afraid, because that meant it had stopped too." I looked back at Walter. His eyes were partly open now, or maybe I had not noticed that before. He was staring past the branch line into a section of woods that sloped down toward a creek bed. There was a drag mark near his leg, but it only ran 2 feet. He had not been moved far. He had died here, and he had died looking at something ahead of him. "Where's the surviving hiker?" I asked. "Doctor's hospital in Lanham for now. Sheriff says you can talk to him after this." I packed the camera for a moment and followed the line of Walter's stare. The woods on that side were older, with fewer saplings and more open ground between trunks. A barbed wire fence stood farther in, old and leaning, half swallowed by brush. Beyond that sat the remains of some structure I could not make out clearly from where I stood. Not a house, maybe a shed or a livestock pen. The roof had fallen in long ago. "Whose land is that?" I asked. "Used to belong to the Bell family. Sold off in pieces. Some of it's county land now, some isn't. Any livestock nearby?" "A few farms south. Nothing close enough to wander up here easily." I took one more pass around the scene. Walter's missing boot turned up near the fence, standing upright in the weeds as if placed there. There was blood inside it, but not much. I photographed it without touching it. 30 feet from that, caught on a barb, hung a strip of wool from Walter's coat. Beside the fence post, the mud was worked over with prints. Some were from boots, some from deer, and then one more of those split marks, deeper than the others. Something had paused there. I heard the strike again, wood on wood. This time it was closer. Collins stepped beside me and drew his sidearm, which I disliked for 2 reasons. First, because fear made men clumsy. Second, because county deputies usually did not draw unless they had already decided what they were afraid of. "What was that?" I said. He swallowed. "You tell me." Then came a third sound, not a strike, but a short scrape that traveled along the fence line and stopped. I moved my head to catch it better. No bird calls, no squirrels. Even the insects had gone thin around us, as if the patch of woods had emptied itself. "Mr. Keene," a voice shouted from the trail behind us. "Deputy." It was one of the volunteers waving from the rise. Collins holstered his gun with visible relief and shouted back. While he did, I looked one last time toward the collapsed structure beyond the fence. Something was standing in the open gap where the roof had fallen. At first, I took it for a post, then it shifted. It was tall enough that the top of it nearly met the broken beam above. Dark from top to bottom, too narrow through the waist, too long in the arms. I saw no face clearly, only a pale suggestion of length where a head should have been, and 2 small points of reflected light set wider apart than human eyes. It stood without moving. I could not hear it. I could not tell how long it had been there. My camera was still in my hand. I raised it by reflex. The thing stepped back once, and it was gone behind the broken wall. By the time I crossed the fence line and pushed through the brush, there was nothing inside the ruin but old hay, damp boards, and the smell of rot rising from the ground. I stopped in the doorway, listening to my own breathing. The back wall had a gap wide enough for a person to pass through, leading into thicker woods and a run of low ground toward the creek. In the mud just beyond the gap were 2 fresh impressions, deep and clean. Split hoof, longer than my hand. That was the moment I understood this would not remain a simple death inquiry. Something had been here while we worked. Something had watched us examine the dead. I did not call out when I saw the prints. I stared at them, then at the low opening beyond the shed, and tried to decide whether I had seen an animal, a man, or something my mind had arranged into the shape I expected after spending 20 minutes over a torn body in cold woods. The prints settled that argument before I could lie to myself. No deer had made them. No boot had made them. Whatever stood in that shed had weight, had come through that gap, and had left only seconds before I reached it. I stepped back into the open and waited for Collins to catch up. He took one look past me, saw nothing, then followed my gaze to the ground. "Jesus," he said, "don't step on them." He stopped at once. I took out the camera again, set the scale marker, and photographed both impressions. The mud held crisp lines along the edges. There were faint ridges at the front, almost as if the hoof had been rough or cracked. One track bit deeper on the right side than the left. A limp, I thought, or a damaged foot. Something to remember. You see it? He asked. In the shed for a second? What was it? I kept the camera up a moment longer before answering. Tall, dark, standing upright. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have. He looked past me again and did not come closer. We marked the area with tape, though neither of us believed tape meant much in a place like that. By the time we returned to the trail, the light had dropped another level. Sheriff Baines stood near the volunteer with his coat collar turned up and his notebook closed. He was a square man in his 50s who had worked farm thefts, drunk driving, a few domestic killings, and once a train yard robbery that he still spoke of as the only interesting thing he had ever handled. Well, he asked. There are tracks beyond the fence, I said. Not human, not any local stock animal I know. That's a careful sentence. It's the only one I'm giving you. Collins glanced at me and then at the sheriff. Sir, he's right, and he saw something in that old shed. Baines looked annoyed before he looked concerned. A person? I don't know, I said, but the surviving witnesses may. The sheriff pressed his lips together, then nodded once. Fine, we'll seal this section till morning and get animal control to take a look. We hiked out with the body left for transport. The path curved through the oak and beech, then rose toward the parking turnout where 2 county cars and the ambulance had stood earlier. Fallen leaves pasted to the trail with each step. At one point, I noticed Collins lagging behind. He kept looking over his shoulder, not openly now, but in short checks, as if afraid the act of staring too long would invite something closer. At the cars, I loaded my cases in the trunk and wiped mud from my hands with a rag. The sky had turned the flat gray that comes before an early autumn dark. A pair of hikers from the volunteer group sat on a tailgate, smoking without speaking. Neither looked eager to go back into the woods for any reason. Sheriff Baines came over while I was closing the trunk. The surviving one is named Thomas Veller, he said. 24, schoolteacher, Annapolis. He and Keene came down for day hiking, parked at the bridge 2 days ago around 10 in the morning, reported overdue by Keene's sister yesterday after sunset. Search started before dawn. He says something followed them, Baines went on, making the words sound more foolish than they already did. They heard it in the brush and saw eyes after dark. Then Keene ran. Veller claims he lost him in the trees. He ran from what? He says he never got a good look. That may have changed. Baines studied my face. You believe him already? I believe Walter Keene didn't tear himself open. That irritated him. Watch the tone. I'm watching the facts. He stepped closer. The facts are 1 dead hiker in county woods and another half out of his head from exposure. Don't build a circus around it because you found a strange track. I shut the trunk. I'm going to the hospital. The drive to Lanham took less than 40 minutes. I spent most of it replaying the shape in the shed. I tried to reduce it to a man in heavy clothing, a trespasser, perhaps a poacher who had stumbled onto the scene and fled. But that did not fit the tracks, and it did not fit the way it had stood. Men shift their weight. What I had seen held itself in a way that felt wrong. Thomas Veller had been cleaned up and moved to a private room because the sheriff requested it. He sat upright in bed with one cheek stitched, both hands bandaged, and a blanket pulled tight around his waist. He looked younger than 24. His hair was still wet from washing. A nurse told me he had asked twice whether the windows locked. I'm Investigator Rennick, I said. County office. I was at the trail. He swallowed. Did you find Walter? Yes. The answer landed hard enough that he looked down at his lap and stayed there a while. I gave him the time. At last he asked, was he hurt bad? Yes. He nodded once, eyes fixed on the blanket. I heard him screaming, and then I didn't. I pulled the chair over and sat near the bed. Tell me from the start, but only what you know for certain. Don't fill in the gaps. Don't guess unless I ask you to. He rubbed the edge of his bandage against the blanket. We came out for one night, just hiking. Walter wanted to camp near the creek because he said he knew a clearing from when he was younger. We missed the turn somewhere in the dark. We argued about it. Then we heard something behind us. In steps? No, not at first. Light brush moving, then stopping when we stopped. We thought maybe deer. Then it stayed with us too long. Did you see it? Not clearly. He hesitated. Walter did before I did. What did he say? He said, "There's a man back there." Then after a minute he said, "No, not a man." I leaned forward. What changed? Thomas looked up at me for the first time since I entered. His face had gone pale again. He said it was too tall. Later, Thomas said, we found the fence. We thought if there was a farm, we could follow it out. Walter shined the flashlight, and there was something standing by the post ahead of us. I only saw it for a second before the light shook it off. It had eyes that caught the beam. Not bright on their own, just caught it. And its head. He stopped. Go on. It didn't look right for any person I know. His breathing changed. I kept my voice level. What happened next? Walter ran. I yelled at him to stop because the ground was bad. I heard him fall. Then I heard something else moving fast. Faster than us. I kept going the other way. I know that sounds bad. He shut his eyes. I heard him call my name once. After that, I just heard the woods. That would have been enough to hold my attention. Then he said one more thing. When I got to the road, he whispered. I looked back. It was standing between the trees, not chasing me, just watching, like it already knew where I was going. I asked him to describe the head. He refused twice, then gave in. Long face, he said. Not fully animal, not fully human either, and horns maybe, or branches behind it. I don't know. I know what I saw, and I know it sounds wrong. Before leaving, I asked one last question. Had either of you heard stories about that area before you went out there? He stared at the wall for a moment. There was a gas station near the highway, he said. Old man at the counter told Walter not to stay past dark near the old farms. Said people around there used to talk about a goat thing in the woods. Walter laughed at him. What was the old man's name? Thomas shook his head. Didn't catch it. I rose to go. As I reached the door, Thomas spoke again. Investigator. I turned. It was there before it showed itself, he said. I know that sounds obvious, but I mean it was with us long before we noticed. I can't explain why I know that. I just do. Outside the room, I wrote every line down while it was fresh. One dead hiker. One witness in shock. Strange tracks. A ruined farm structure beyond the fence line. And now, local talk, old enough to reach a gas station. I left the hospital with the notes still open in my hand and sat in the car for a minute without starting it. Thomas Veller's account had the usual marks of fear, but it also held detail where fear usually breaks a story apart. He had not tried to make it make sense. That counted for something. I read back through what I had written and circled two items, the gas station and the old farms beyond the fence. The road north from the hospital ran past the stretch of low businesses that closed early. The gas station he mentioned sat near the junction where the highway curved toward Bowie. It was a narrow building with two pumps out front and a sign that had lost half its lettering. The office light was still on. I pulled in and parked under it. A bell rang when I opened the door. The place smelled of oil and stale tobacco. Behind the counter stood an older man with a gray shirt buttoned to the neck and a pencil tucked over one ear. He looked at me. We're closed, he said. I'm not here for gas, I told him, and showed him my badge. That changed his posture. Not much, but enough. What can I do for you? I'm looking for information about a pair of hikers who came through here yesterday. One is dead. The other is in the hospital. His eyes moved once toward the window and then back to me. That's so. They spoke with someone at a station near here who warned them about the woods. He did not answer right away. He took the pencil from his ear and set it on the counter. A lot of people say a lot of things to pass time. Did you warn them? I might have told them not to get lost. Did you mention anything else? He looked past me again, then reached for a pack of cigarettes. "You're talking about the old Bell property," he said at last, "and the woods around it." "I am." He rested both hands on the counter. "People around here don't go into that section after dark. Haven't for years. Not because of one story, but because of many. Tell me one." He lit a cigarette and drew a slow breath. "Back in the 50s, a farmer south of here lost 3 goats in a week. Found them torn open near the fence lines. No tracks he could make sense of. Then a boy went missing for 2 days and came back saying he'd followed a man through the trees. Said the man never turned around. Said the legs bent wrong when it stepped over logs." I did not write while he spoke. I watched his face. He was not performing for me. "Any names?" I asked. Farmer was Kenny. Boy was his nephew. They moved after that, sold off their land piece by piece. "Anyone else report sightings?" "People don't report what they can't prove. They just avoid it." "Why warn those 2? He shrugged. "Because they looked like they didn't know the place. Because it cost nothing to tell someone to be careful." "And what did you call it?" He gave a small, humorless smile. "Around here, folks say Goatman. Not because it makes sense, but because it's easier to say." I let the words sit in the room. It did not fit in any official form I would file. It did fit the witness account, and it fit the tracks. "Do you know who owns the structure beyond the fence now?" I asked. "County took part of it. The rest is still in the Bell name on paper, though no Bell has lived there in a long time." "Anyone check it recently?" He shook his head. "Why would they?" "Because a man is dead." "That's not new to those woods," he said, and then seemed to regret it. "I mean, accidents happen, people get turned around." I thanked him and left. Outside, the air had turned colder. The station light buzzed above the pumps. For a moment, I thought about going back out to the site that night. I did not. I wanted daylight on the ground and a second set of trained eyes. I also wanted to see the records before I stepped back into that section. The county office opened at 8. I was there before the clerk unlocked the file room. Older reports were kept in cabinets that had not been reorganized in years. I asked for any incidents tied to the Bell property, the adjacent county land, and the surrounding roads back to 1950. It took an hour to pull up the boxes. Most of it was nothing. Trespass complaints, a barn fire listed as accidental, a missing dog. Then a set of notes from 1961 caught my attention. A deputy had logged livestock deaths along a fence line, cause unknown, with remarks about unusual impressions in wet ground. No photographs attached. The case was closed as predation. Another file from 1968 described a driver who claimed something had stood in the road near the same area after midnight. He had swerved into a ditch. The responding officer noted, "No obstruction found," and listed the driver as possibly intoxicated. The driver had a clean test. The case was closed. A third file from 1970 mentioned a group of teenagers who said they had been followed while walking the back roads. They reported hearing steps that matched theirs, but never seeing the person. The officer wrote, "Prank likely," and sent them home. Individually, each file meant little. Together, they drew a loose line around the same piece of land. I copied the relevant pages and took them to Sheriff Baines. He read them with a frown that deepened as he went. "Old stories," he said when finished. "You can make a pattern out of anything if you reach far back enough." I didn't reach. These were in the same cabinet. He set the papers down. "What do you want?" "I want a second team on the site today. I want a vet or a wildlife officer who can rule out known animals. And I want authority to search the structure and the surrounding woods thoroughly." "You have authority to search county land. Half of it is not clearly county. Then I'll call it in. You'll have it for the day. And I want the area closed to the public. That will bring attention. So will another body." He held my gaze for a moment, then nodded. "You'll have it until sunset. After that, we pull back and reassess. By late morning, I was back on the trail with Collins, a wildlife officer named Klein, and two volunteers who knew how to keep their distance from evidence. Klein was a practical man with a notebook and a rifle he hoped not to use. He walked the ground with me, examined the tracks I had marked, and shook his head. "Not deer," he said. "Not goat. Too big and the wrong shape. No sign of claw for bear. And the stride. He measured it himself. I don't like it." We crossed the fence and entered the ruined structure in full daylight. What had felt cramped the day before now looked simply neglected. The hay was old and damp. Boards lay scattered where the roof had given way. There were no tools, no recent trash, nothing to suggest a person had taken shelter there in any ordinary way. "Smell that," Collins said. Klein nodded. "Rot. Maybe a carcass nearby." We followed the scent out the back gap and into the low ground. It led us to a shallow depression where water collected after rain. At the edge of it lay the remains of an animal half covered in leaves. The body had been opened along the side. The ribs were exposed. There was little meat left, but the pattern of the cuts matched what I had seen on Walter Keene. "Dog," Collins said. Klein knelt and examined the skull. "Too big for most dogs. Could be a small deer. Hard to tell with this much gone." "Cause?" I asked. He looked at the edges of the bone and the torn hide. "Not clean bites. Not what I'd expect from coyotes. This was opened, not chewed through first." We mapped the depression and marked it for collection later. From there, the tracks led deeper into the woods, then thinned out where the ground turned dry. We spread out to keep a line of sight and moved slowly. The woods were quiet in a way that made every small sound stand out. We worked the area for another hour without finding anything that settled the matter. Then, as we began to circle back toward the fence, I heard it again, wood on wood. A single hard knock. Everyone stopped. "Where?" Collins asked. I pointed toward a stand of trees beyond the depression. The sound came again, 2 knocks this time, spaced evenly. Klein raised his rifle, not aiming, just ready. "Could be someone out there," he said. "Then they're using a strange signal," I replied. We moved toward the sound in a tight line. The ground dipped slightly, then rose. At the top of the rise stood another section of old fence, this one broken in places and half buried. Beyond it lay a narrow path that did not match any marked trail on the county map. "Stay together," I said. We stepped over the fence one by one. The air felt different there. I cannot explain that better than to say it felt closed, as if the trees held it down. The path ran straight for about 30 yards and then bent left around a cluster of rocks. At the bend, the tracks returned, fresh and deep. "Just made," Collins said. I agreed. The edges had not yet softened. We followed them around the bend. That's when we saw it. It stood in the open, between 2 trees, facing us. Tall, dark, limbs too long for a man. The legs bent with a backward angle at the lower joint that no human joint makes. The head held forward, long in the face, with 2 shapes rising from it that could have been horns. The eyes caught the light again, not shining on their own, but reflecting enough to show they were set wider than a human's. The thing did not move at first. It watched us in a way that felt measured, not startled. I felt the same certainty Thomas had described. It had known where we were before we saw it. Klein lifted his rifle. "Don't," I said quietly. He froze, then lowered it a fraction. The thing took 1 step to the side. The hoof struck the ground with a dull, heavy sound. Then it turned and moved between the trees with a speed that broke the line of sight before any of us could follow. "Go," Collins said, already moving. "Stop," I said louder. We stayed together. We held position for a full minute, listening. No running, no crashing through brush, only the faint movement of leaves settling. Klein let out a slow breath. "You all saw that?" "Yes," I said. "What is it?" one of the volunteers asked. I looked at the path, at the fresh tracks leading into the deeper timber, and then at the line of woods that swallowed them. "It's the thing that killed Walter Keene," I said. We marked the spot and withdrew in order, keeping eyes on the path until the fence came back into view. Back at the main trail, I wrote everything while it was clear and had each man give his account separately. The descriptions matched in the points that mattered. By the time we returned to the vehicles, the decision had already formed. This was no longer a question of what we could name. It was a question of what we would do with something we could not. Back at the vehicles, I closed my notebook and stood for a moment with the sound of the woods still in my ears. Klein unloaded his rifle and set it in the rack without looking at me. Collins kept his eyes on the tree line. The volunteers stayed near the tailgate and did not smoke this time. Sheriff Baines arrived within 20 minutes. He stepped out of his car, took one look at our faces, and stopped short of asking a question he did not want answered. "Well," he said instead. "We have a live subject," I told him. "Large, bipedal, not human, not any local animal I can identify. It was within 30 yards of us. We all saw it." He looked at Klein. "You too?" Klein nodded. "I can't name it." Baines pressed his lips together. "You fired?" "No," Klein said. "Good," Baines replied, though it did not sound like approval so much as relief that something had not yet gone beyond control. I handed him my notes from the morning. There are fresh tracks along a secondary path beyond the old fence. There's a carcass consistent with the injuries on Keene. There are markings on trees above 6 feet. The witness account matches what we saw. Baines flipped through the pages, then shut them and held them at his side. "You want me to call the state and tell them we have a... what? Some kind of animal we can't describe? I want the area closed. I want the area closed. I want a perimeter posted on the access roads. And I want this written as an active hazard until we know more. That will bring every hunter in the county down here. Then we don't make it public. We restrict access under safety. We keep people out." He stared at me long enough that I could see the calculation behind his eyes. Not about the truth of it, about the cost. "What happens if we do nothing?" he asked. "Someone else goes in. Someone else goes in. Someone else dies. All right, we'll close the section and post deputies at the bridge and the lower road. You'll put together a report I can sign that doesn't use words I can't defend in front of the county board. I can do that. And the rest of it," he said, tapping the notebook, "stays between us." "For now," I said. He did not like that answer, but he let it stand. We cleared out by mid-afternoon. The volunteers were dismissed with instructions not to return. Klein said he would speak to the state wildlife office without committing anything in writing yet. Collins stayed with me as we drove back toward the station. "You think it'll stay in those woods?" he asked. "I think it already knows the edges better than we do." At the office, I wrote the first version of the report. I kept the language tight. One deceased male with severe tearing injuries. One surviving witness with consistent account of being followed. Unidentified animal sign present. Area recommended for temporary closure pending further investigation. I did not include the word Goatman. I did not include horns. I did not include the measurements of the tracks and the location of the carcass. I attached photographs that showed what could be shown without inviting ridicule from anyone who had not stood where we had stood. Sheriff Baines signed it before closing time. Orders went out to post the access point and keep people away after dusk. The file was stamped and placed in the active cabinet. That night, I did not go home. I drove back toward the bridge and parked a quarter-mile off the road where the trees thickened again. I turned off the lights and sat with the engine off. The temperature dropped fast after sunset. The woods took on a different sound, not louder but more focused. Every movement carried. I told myself I was there to confirm the perimeter held. That was only part of it. The other part was the sense that leaving it alone would not keep it contained. It had watched us in daylight. It had not fled far. That meant it did not treat us as it would treat something it feared. Around 10, I heard a single knock from deeper in the trees, wood on wood. I waited. 10 seconds. 20. Then 2 knocks, spaced evenly. The same pattern we had heard earlier. I stepped out of the car and closed the door without slamming it. The beam from my flashlight cut a narrow path between the trunks. I kept it on low, on the ground, looking for tracks. The soil near the road was packed, but a few yards in it softened enough to hold impressions. I found one within a minute, fresh, deep, facing the road. I followed it a short distance until the line of prints angled away and disappeared into thicker brush. I stopped there. Going farther alone at night would have been a decision without any support behind it. I stood still and listened. The feeling came back then. Not fear in the way a sudden noise causes it, but a steady awareness that I was not the only one choosing where to stand. "Rennick," a voice said behind me. I turned. It was Collins coming up the road with his coat pulled tight. "Sheriff told me you'd be out here," he said. "Figured you shouldn't be alone." "I didn't ask you to come." "I know." He stepped off the road and joined me where the ground turned soft. He saw the print without being told. "It came this way," he said. "Yes." We stood together for a minute without speaking. Then Collins said, "If it crosses the road, what do? We stop it." "With what?" I did not answer. We both knew the options were poor. The knocks came again, this time from closer than before. 1, then 2. Collins' hand moved toward his sidearm. I kept mine where it was. "Light off," I said. He clicked his flashlight off. I did the same. The dark closed in at once. Our eyes adjusted slowly. The road behind us held a faint gray line. The woods ahead were deeper than that. There was a movement to our left, not fast, a shift between 2 trunks, then stillness. "Do you see?" Collins began. "Yes." It stood partly behind a tree, angled so that only the head and one shoulder showed. The eyes caught what little light there was. The shape of the head was clearer than in daylight, long, narrow, with 2 horns. The arm that rested against the trunk was too long. The hand set low. It did not step forward. It did not retreat. "What does it want?" Collins whispered. I thought of Walter Keene on the ground. I thought of the carcass by the depression. The thing shifted its weight. The hoof touched down with that same dull sound. Then it turned its head slightly, not toward us, but toward the road behind us, as if checking the distance to something else. "Back up," I said. We took 1 step together, then another, keeping our bodies angled toward it. At the edge of the road, we stopped. The thing remained where it was for a few seconds more. Then it stepped behind the tree fully and moved away without sound. We returned to the car and drove back to the station without speaking. The next morning, I added a supplement to the report. I did not describe the form. I noted continued presence of unidentified subject near perimeter after hours, and recommended that the closure remain in effect with patrols at dusk and dawn. By the end of the week, the area had been marked as restricted. The official line was unstable ground and risk to the public. The file was moved from active to limited circulation. Requests for access were denied without explanation. I went back twice more in daylight over the following month. Each time, the tracks appeared and then stopped with the ground turned hard. Each time, the carcasses we found matched the same pattern. Each time, we heard the knocks at least once. We never saw it again in full. In my final entry, I wrote that the case could not be resolved under current methods. I recommended indefinite restriction of the area and minimal disturbance of the interior. I noted that the subject showed awareness of human movement, avoided direct confrontation in daylight, and did not leave the boundary it had chosen except to approach it. I signed it and closed the folder. The case is closed on paper. It is not closed in the woods. Good night. Good night. I love you.